All right, welcome to this edition of The Examined Life. My name is Nathan McCullough, and I have a dear friend and an amazing human being, Ryan Johnson, that is with me today. And for those of you who are new to The Examined Life, this is a podcast that is committed to the philosophy, the transformative power of philosophy. And I'm deeply committed to the idea that a lot of the things that we're dealing with as a humanity are things that can benefit significantly from thinking clearly, from philosophical approaches to things, and being able to potentially uncover some of the historical influences for the things that we do think about, and for uncovering new ways of thinking about things in the future that can lead to more productive lives. And I really believe that philosophy throughout history has served that purpose. And I think that philosophy is not serving that purpose at the moment. And I would love to, bring more of the philosophical discourse into the town square, if you will, of social media, and see if we can cultivate conversations that spark people to think differently, people to be exposed to different types of ideas, and be inspired to not necessarily be an academic philosopher, but to bring the ideas of philosophy into life and live an examined life, right? The idea is that back in the day, Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And I believe that that's very true. And to live an examined life means to think critically about the things that you think, things that you maybe believe and don't know you believe, and just really examine our thinking. So with that in the background, I have known Ryan for a long time. We started off as friends, and I just love him. He's an amazing guy. We went to master's program at Kent State University, and I have basically failed as a professional academic philosopher, and but have really gone on to study leadership. I've gone on to study coaching in particular through a phenomenological and ontological lens, and I'm very passionate about how philosophy can help inform the way that we live. And Ryan has dare I say, succeeded as an academic philosopher, and is doing a lot of really great work. So I wanted to have Ryan on today, both because I respect you as a human being, and I'm very interested in the work that you're doing, and really I'm just interested in having interesting conversations with interesting people, and you, my friend, are one of those people. So Ryan is an associate professor at Elon University. And I'll say a couple of things about what I think your thought kind of focuses on, and then you can clear up my confusions. But let's say your areas of specialty are Hegel, and then actually I'll let you share maybe what your areas of specialty are. Because I'm not sure if I will do it justice. I know that Deleuze has always been a main figure of yours. Hegel is definitely there, and you're doing a lot of work. And I don't know whether to call it critical philosophy or not, because that term has become a point of confusion for me. So I almost said that one of your main focuses is critical theory, but I don't know if that's actually true, and I don't even know what that means. It just dawned on me, so I don't want to make assumptions. So welcome to the show, Ryan. Please share anything else that you would like to say about yourself and kind of what your main focus is.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very kind of you and flattering to be asked, and always just have a nice conversation with a very old friend from like 2006 or 7, right? Like, so it's been been a minute. Yeah, I had a shift in my thinking that occurred when I began at Elon after grad school, around 2015, 2016. Before then, I was really into contemporary French philosophy, particularly Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze, interested in questions of embodiment and materiality, a lot of art, because I actually came to philosophy as a, well, there's many stories about how one come to philosophy. I'm not sure which ones are real. The one I often tell is that I'm a failed painter. I actually came to, I don't know if you know this, Nate, but I came to Kent State wanting to be a painter, but then was terrified of a blank canvas and just couldn't realize how bad I was at painting. But then I took a class with Frank Ryan, American philosophy class, still teaching at Kent, and then realized, oh, this allows me to study all sorts of things. So then I started to just get into philosophy, but I originally was looking at contemporary philosophy, and carried that through into my grad school, my PhD program at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, and studied. I started doing a lot of modern philosophy, a lot of history, but I always kept Deleuze in the background. So I studied a lot of Spinoza, a lot of Descartes, a lot of modern philosophy, early modern philosophy, and a lot of Hegel. And then for my graduate work, I started to do work on Deleuze. And it was an odd thing happened that as I was taking my comprehensive exams, I finally studied ancient philosophy. I never took any ancient philosophy ever. And then I got really into it, particularly Lucretius and the Roman atomists. And so then I wrote my dissertation on that. And then that led into a first book, and that led into a second book about Deleuze and Stoicism. So the two maybe main philosophical schools in the Hellenistic and Roman period are Epicureanism or atomism, and not those are synonymous, but there's overlap, and Stoicism. And Deleuze, as a reader of the history of philosophy, is what really drove me to him. He found in the history of philosophy ideas that I found absolutely exciting, as opposed to kind of the more run-of-the-mill, rather boring, and you could say, academics reading the history of philosophy. There's like the living things. So so Deleuze, French philosophy, and ancient Hellenistic and Roman philosophy was my go-to. So, but then I came here and I remembered the conversations I had with my teacher, one of my, actually I wasn't remember my teacher, but he was an important person for me, who named George Yancey. He was an amazing African-American philosopher, critical philosophy of race, critical race theory person. And he told me first about this guy named Frantz Fanon, the great Martinique psychologist, phenomenologist, decolonial thinker, all that. And I remember reading it and thinking like, what the heck is this? I've never seen anything like it. I can read Hegel, I can read Deleuze, what is going on? So that stuck with me. And then my wife, who's not from the US, moved to the South as I came to Elon and began, and started to encounter the country, especially the South, through her eyes, through an immigrant eyes, and started thinking about race and whiteness and blackness in a new way. And then George Yancey came to campus and spoke, and like he brings the fire, and he set Elon on fire, and me too. And I remember it was actually a teaching experience. I remember teaching his work as we were preparing for George Yancey to come, and some Malcolm X and some Ta-Nehisi Coates. And I remember the excitement in the classroom felt like those moments that I experienced as a student when you were most like encountering Nietzsche the first time. Most of like these ideas that are dangerous, ideas that are unsettling, ideas that make you examine your life and rethink, and that foundation come out from under you. I remember feeling this teaching Malcolm X, for example, and because it did something to me, right? What is like a white dude here teaching about blackness? Like, this is a totally new thing. In the South, in a classroom is majority white. In an institution, there's a primarily predominantly white institution. It's 80% white, even a little higher back then. It was just alive and exciting and risky and dangerous. But it really, this is where I think I agree with you totally about the role of philosophy in the contemporary world. Philosophy has these skills or these tools or this drive maybe to examine one's life and especially for an American white straight guy. Like, this is exactly it. Like, if it's not about this, what is it about? Like, what's a more dominant thing than maleness and whiteness and class in the US? And so the ability to get better at thinking about race from the perspective of a white dude was just the most, it was like I've been preparing for this my whole life. It's possible been preparing me for doing this. And that became the dominant philosophical question for me. What is whiteness? What is racial justice? What is blackness? And all these things, especially how it calls on us in our particular embodiment. So I was like, all right, this is what I got to start doing this. And that then led into my forthcoming book, but I don't know if you want me to go there.
Yeah, so I all of these ideas I do want to go into, and I think it's exciting. This is kind of exactly what I wanted to draw out of you. So, but before we go there, I am interested to learn a little bit more about, aside from specific, philosophical ideas and, doors that you want to open and go down, just the idea of philosophy. Like, what does philosophy mean for Ryan Johnson? Because I know it means different things for different people.
Yeah, it's I remember before I came to Elon, I spent a year as a visiting professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And it was I loved it there. It was very different teaching technical school. Like, it wasn't a technical, but it was different kinds of students. It wasn't like Kent State, which is liberal arts. It wasn't like Elon. It was a school for scientists and mathematicians. But I remember students kept asking me this question, like, what is philosophy? And I thought, oh, well, how about this? Like, every 2 years, I'll rewrite a paper that says, what is philosophy? And I did it for like 2 years, and then never did it again. It means several things. I think one thing it means is exactly what you mean by it, which is an examine life, which means for me, is a great word, indefatigable, unflinching self-examination, right? And that doesn't mean individualistically at all. It actually means very much the opposite of this. I don't think Socrates meant this at all. I think what community meant for him was very different than what it means for us. So it's not actually examining oneself by oneself. It actually means examining oneself in community, in the way that Sartre will say that others know you far more than you know you. So examination needs that. So I think philosophy in one sense is that, like, unflinching examination of oneself in community with others. I think that's the first thing. A related thing points to another person who was really influential for me and my change in thinking that occurred when I came to Elon, which is another French philosopher, one who was really influential on Foucault. His name is Pierre Hadot. Do you know Hadot?
I know of Hadot, but I haven't read his work.
Yeah, Pierre Hadot, or English Hadot, is a guy who's an ancient French philosopher who actually wasn't trained really much in the fancy French schools in the 20th century, but was trained in a seminary, really, and then later came out of that. So, but he had this idea, which was he was reading a lot of the Hellenistic people, which I like Marcus Aurelius in particular. And he saw in the scholarship and like the really rigorous, really pretentious, and really sophisticated French classical philosophy, or philosophy of the classics and the ancients, he saw this division between the fancy Plato and the really complicated Aristotle, something like that, versus the less complicated and the less sophisticated Marcus Aurelius and Stoics and stuff like that. And he thought, that's weird. I don't think that is really true. And so he started trying to figure out like why there's this division. And what he came to believe is that prior to the rise of the Christian church and the medieval ages, their philosophy was a different kind of thing. It was a way of life, right? This is the phrase philosophy as a way of life. So it was just as you live as a mason or a soldier or whatever, a philosopher was a way of living. And then what we call philosophy, often like the theory, the abstracted from the practice, was always aimed at the life. So the primary category of philosophy was the life, and theory was simply meant to improve that, change that, enhance that, that kind of stuff. And then when the church came around and became dominant, they started to spread the practice from the theory and take over. And so you could be a Christian but not know the theory. While the ones who were in the church and the monasteries and blah blah became the universities, they became the ones who knew the theory. So I also think that philosophy is a way of life in that sense. No, I don't think we can ever get back to that. I'm not even sure we want to, but the idea of it being a lived practice, and that you're not a philosopher at work and then you leave work and all of a sudden you're something else, is that if you're a philosopher, your entire life is that, right? So everything that you do is philosophical. And then that opened up this really crazy idea for me, which is, okay, then what else can be considered philosophy is things that you do in other parts of your life. So just as some philosophy books, some philosophical conversations, some conversations are philosophical and some are not. Some ways of eating are philosophy and some are not. Some ways of walking are philosophy and some are not. So now everything becomes potentially a way of doing, of being or living philosophically. So there's two main things. One, this relentless examination of oneself in community with others. And then this way of life, which is an expansive, all-encompassing practice. I think those are the two main ways I would envision philosophy.
Okay, yeah, I've been listening to a lot of the John Vervaeke, who did like a 56-part series on awakening from the meaning crisis, and he mentions it a lot, a lot. Like this kind of his go-to when it comes to the ancient, his understanding of the ancient tradition. And yeah, it's called Philosophy as a Way of Life, right? That's one of the books that he wrote. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, very interesting. So, and it's interesting because even the coaching work that I do in the work on leadership, it's an ontological, phenomenological approach to leadership. And the guy who teaches it, the methodology at least, he talks about this is not a course on leadership. Like this is not going to be an intellectual exercise where we're distinguishing, historical examples or the theory of leadership. The whole point of the course is to leave you being a leader in life. And that doesn't mean you're in an organization who has a team and like that. Like it is a way of life. And part of the reason why I've been so attracted to that world is because exactly it mirrors my thoughts on philosophy, which is exactly what you were saying. It's not a discipline. It's not a discipline, but it's not, it's a practice. So it's a way of life. And so I think that's interesting. Now, how about, I know that Deleuze and Guattari wrote a book called What is Philosophy, right? Where they said something along the lines of, and this is probably bastardization, but philosophy is the creation of concepts, which seems very Nietzschean, but I don't know. So how does that concept differ from what you were just saying? And because you mentioned Deleuze a couple of times, and I know that the ancients were had an impact on Deleuze, and in a lot of ways, his training was kind of in the history of philosophy, but then he decided, boring, okay, I'm going to look at other things that are maybe not so well known and focus on those. So what was his idea about what philosophy is?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, that he and Guattari definitely wrote the book, the What is Philosophy, and it was supposed to be a textbook for like a schools, like it's meant to be widely used. It is not that at all. But in there they find philosophy as a creation of concept, something like formulation, fabrication, production of concepts, or whatever maybe. So there's the question about how that relates to philosophy as a way of life, like how does this fit or not, right? Besides just saying, oh, it's a way of life that produces concepts, but I think that's cheap and not very informative at all. I don't know how much I agree with that or think that. Like, I think it's really interesting. And I also know that he wrote that near the end of his life, and as he was old, right? And so sometimes that leads to really beautiful things. Sometimes it leads to cheesier things, and
Not so beautiful things.
yeah. At least like powerful, maybe less powerful things.
Mm.
I'm much more in a person who loves the earlier Deleuze
Okay.
than the later Deleuze. But I've often thought about the connection between philosophy as a way of life versus philosophy as the creation of concepts. And the way I think, I'm trying to recall this, but it's been a while since I thought about this, but I think the way I've thought about it is that the creation of philosopher is a way of life, and the concepts that are created come out of the existential urgencies, like alliteration, the existential exigencies that are demanded by that life. So we don't just, and this is something that's really important in Deleuze, I fully agree with this. We don't one day come up with like, hey, I want to create a concept. Like, I'm bored, I have a Sunday afternoon, I'm going to create a concept. I don't think that's the case at all. And instead, there is an urgency, a necessity, right? It's not a choice, it's not free. You need to create a concept. And that need comes from that concrete life that you're living. And so the philosopher is the one who's able to create the concepts that respond to those needs and have and always bear the trace of them. So that's they're very historically, concretely, and bodily determinate. So I would say something like philosophy is a way of life, and the creation of concepts are the ways in which that life is retains its philosophical character.
Yeah, okay, that's cool. Yeah, I dig that. So the concepts are what's demanded of one given what's going on in the current situation, and the philosopher is the one who's sensitive to what's being called for.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's right. Yeah.
Okay, and in terms of your own path of development, I didn't know the thing about painting, by the way. So you had the painter's block, and that's like what led to philosophy. But what was it really that made you pursue this as a way of life for yourself?
Yeah, this brings in my other ways of saying how I got into philosophy, which I don't know which one's right. You say a story over and over, and eventually you're like, was that real, or is that just what I've been saying? There's a few answers to that though. So here, one is that I remember at the end of my first year at Kent, when I was an undergrad, and I was sitting outside the library, the tallest building in Portage County, and with a friend, I'm thinking like, I don't think I can do this painting thing. What do I do? And someone said philosophy. And they're like, you can do philosophy of anything. I was like, kind of knew what philosophy was. I tried to read Nietzsche in high school and failed, but pretended I could, right? And sort of realized I can do philosophy of anything. And I wanted to study so many things, right? I wanted to study journalism and French and politics and religion and art and history and blah, blah. So I wanted to study all these things, but I couldn't get that much time in school, much as I would love to. And so philosophy was a way of developing sets of skills and tools and practices and habits that could allow me to take up all those things. So it became this very multi-adaptable tool. So that's one reason I got into philosophy. Another way is that I remember as a middle-class white dude growing up in outside of Cleveland in very white suburbs, reading the Beat Generation, reading Kerouac and Ginsberg and those people, and I remember particularly them talking about these figures, the intellectuals, and being like, what's an intellectual? And just being kind of drawn to that. And that way of life of being an intellectual, one who spends life in learning communities with books, dwelling on classic ideas and thinking about revolutionary ideas and all of that, and in particular in communities. So like one of the reasons why I think I had so much fun at Kent with you or in grad school or wherever were how the conversations and the real relationships occurred around these ideas, right? Thinking about you with moods, right? And Stimmungen, right? Like that kind of thing, and spending hours in your house on your deck just doing that, or days, who knows, right? Like that was a real meaningful relationship about things that I was interested in, and other people were too. So once I entered into that, once I said I'll do this, and I decided, I remember telling my dad, like a week after outside the library, I had a conversation with that guy. I said, "Oh, I'm going to get a PhD in philosophy and become a philosopher." And he said, "Sure, great." and he then, when I graduated, he said, "Well, you did it. I really didn't think you would do." So
Oh, Peter.
so after I did that, then the community was real, and that then became the thing for me.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've actually I've never thought about that connection so much, like the philosophy having to be done in the community, and that it's not the examined life is not something that you are doing with yourself, critically in that sense. But yeah, it's like Socrates in the symposium, and like involving a little bit of some wine and some rhetorical conversations, and having that. That's interesting. I remember one of the illusions that's always stuck with me is, and I can't even remember what dialogue it was in, but this idea that you rub sticks together, that's
Yeah.
what creates fire.
Yeah, it's Theaetetus. I think it's Theaetetus, isn't it?
Yeah. So, but that idea that it's the engagement of ideas with other people that actually leads to something. It's not something that happens in a silo. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, Deleuze and Guattari start their book A Thousand Plateaus, which sounds something like, we were already several, and now we're more. Right? So that one is not one. One is always so that kind of thing. And of course, just Socrates. When is ever Socrates thinking alone to himself?
Right.
How do we go from necessity of dialectical practice to somebody alone? So anyway, it's never been alone. It's always been Mitsein, always been with others, right?
Yeah, interesting. Actually, one of the reasons that I've become so passionate about this again is that when I watched the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series with John Vervaeke, they have a practice called circling that he's working on with a guy named Guy Sensak, and they have a particular technology that they're using to think through pertinent ideas and things that are important. There's a high focus, let's say, on listening, recreating other people's communication, and like basically mirroring each other and having ideas, and this focus on the dialogical and how that's our future. I mean, to hear him talk, it's literally like our future rests on our ability to retrieve the idea of dialogical communication and out of being in silos and really engaging with thinking critically with other people, and how that is what invests our own life with meaning, right? But also in the polis, like the idea that that it's meaning all the way down, and that this is the critical thing. And it ignited a real fire for me again. So I appreciate the fact that you said that. That's awesome.
Yeah, for sure. And that's what my classroom and teaching is all about.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about that, like philosophy not in the esoteric sense and what's in the books and everything, but and then inside of the way of life, there's also the practice of teaching. How do you I guess for me, philosophy has to be transformative, right?
Mhm.
In that sense, like it has that power,
Yeah.
and a lot of it happens in the classroom. Like I remember my first exposure to philosophy. You know, Jerome Miller. You know, he was like, crawling around on the floor, throwing erasers. You know, first class. It was philosophy of religion, and we're like reading Heidegger, reading Nietzsche, and I was just like, in that moment, I was so captivated by what was happening. Like no one else behaves like this, thinks like this. I was just all in right off the bat.
Yeah.
So what is that process of teaching like for you?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. It's I love talking about that thing because it's so many ways to go at it. Try to make it as clear but fast as I can. Uh, so after I defended my dissertation, and I was teaching an adjunct class at Kent and Akron University, and applying, and I started reading it down, and I remember I was talking to this guy, and he had sent me a voice memo thing as he was walking, and I was going to class to teach. The first time I received one, I was like, "This is weird." Uh, and we're going to teach Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and I had this thought as he was doing it that a classroom is not mine. A classroom is collectively constructed. It's co-constructed. So as much as I might bring energy or roll on the floor or whatever that, like, and some people are going to dig that, right? But not everyone is. And because it's not only up to me, right? If it were only up to me, then it'd be an authoritarian space, right? And that's not what learning is. So I had this moment of crisis about like, shit, I've been doing this all wrong. I was also reading Paul Feyer's Pedagogy of the Oppressed and that kind of stuff. And so I started thinking like, I'm teaching as a way to reinforce the passivity and not thinking and like maybe not oppression, but like things that can be characterized in some way as oppressive. So I thought, this is not good. And I remember being in the classroom, and I had my notes, which I used to lecture. I haven't lectured since this moment. Reading these notes, and you ever eaten something really dry, and you just like lose all moisture in your mouth and you start to kind of choke, and you can barely breathe, like, you're coughing. I was reading these words that I was lecturing with, and it happened, and I thought, like, what's going on? This is bad. And then I said, like, screw this. I threw the notes on the floor, and very dramatically, and I said, let's get in a circle, and everyone just hold out your book, which is printouts from the Nicomachean Ethics. And I said, just turned to the student next to me and said, now just start reading, and when you stop understanding, just stop, and it'll be our duty to make sense of it, and let's just do this. And then we did. And then I started to think about, just started from that moment, and I was alive again, right? And I could breathe again, I could talk again. All those things happened. So this is all happening, and then I get this job at Elon, and it's all about wild teaching. Their whole goal is to make teaching philosophy exciting and transformative. In fact, they put on 2 conferences, which is philosophy as transformative practice, in which they invited philosophers, practitioners, artists, farmers, all types of people for 2 years in a row, or 2 years, and did this. And they thought, because they believed that philosophy can be transformative for everyone. And the reason why this is because the spirit of our department, this John Sullivan, was like the sole philosopher back in the 70s and 80s. And he realized that, why is he teaching philosophy as a pre-professional discipline? How many people in the class are actually going on to become philosophers, let alone even go to grad school? It's like one, maybe 1 or 2 go to grad school. almost none become. So we thought, why are we doing this? Philosophy can be transformative, can be meaningful, can be empowering for, they used to call it the one offer, which I think is not a very attractive term, but the one who takes at least one class. Like, what do we do for that person? So let's orient our whole department, our whole departmental practice around that person. And then if people want to go to grad school, sure, we'll deal with that. But let's start there. This is not pre-professional. This is transformative for Kevin. Kevin, who's going to be mid-level manager at whatever, all bits. I don't know. So, and so when they're doing this every day, and so when I got to Elon, they're encouraging me to say, yeah, go wild, do whatever you want. So like 3 weeks later into my first week, first semester at Elon, I'm doing this class on walking, and I have my students all blindfolded, and actually in 2 lines. The person in the front was not blindfolded, but the rest of them were, and they have an arm on the person in front of them so they can walk along. And I'm just walking around blindfolded around campus, and this amazing thing was happening. They were like nervous at first and laughing, and then they got quiet again, and they started talking. And then like half hour in, they reached this like collective embodiment. I don't know how to put it in a less fancy way. When they actually were moving so fast, I, who was walking alongside, was hard to keep up. They started moving really fast. I don't know, they had synced. And I was like, this is freaking weird. And then the dean had the gall to come over and say, what are you doing? You're hazing these people. I'm like, no, I'm in class. And I'm like, they're getting away. Like, and I was like, hold on. I had to run up there and say, all right, the dean saw me. I don't know what's going to go on. I was kind of nervous. This is one classroom. And then I later told, that evening I told my chair, because I thought, oh man, what's going on? I was like, she's going to apologize to you. There's no way they're interfering with your pedagogical autonomy. And then they all demanded that this person apologize to me. And I was like, oh, I can do anything. So then I started to do wild things, like teach a class on Zen Buddhism, where we had a whole discussion without speaking, right? Silence. We just discussed, it was silence, right? Or we had a whole class we were teaching Heraclitus, where we only spoke in verbs and adverbs, and we hadn't moved the entire time. And in the next class, we had a class only on Parmenides, where we only spoke in adjectives and nouns, and we remained perfectly seated the whole time, right? So then I just went to town. I mean, there's so many examples of going, doing wild things, but it was all about this idea that philosophy can be a transformative practice. It is that primarily. How do we translate that into not just wild ideas, but actually effective and efficient pedagogical exercises and experiments? And then things went on from there.
So is that related to, because I know that we were leaving voice messages back and forth as well. So is that related to, because you mentioned an idea about the improv as a pedagogy, or dance as a pedagogy, like, so are those ideas related in the sense that it's an embodied experience and that there is something there as well?
Yes. So I've become increasingly interested in improvisation, because one of the things that started to occur as this teaching growth happened was that I, as I mentioned, stopped lecturing. And so I then started to structure classes based using assignments that the students brought in the material. And my role was to sculpt conversations. So I didn't know what was going to happen. I don't know what the conversations are going to be about. They could be about anything, right? We could end up outside. And this is actually, being the sound is a great thing. I have only taught outside for the last 2 years. So this is whole question that's there. But so it's about improvisation and about sculpting collectively ideas, and how I can create dialogical and discursive exercises and structures and spaces that encourage and increase and enhance those improvisational experiences. Dance was also a separate thing, but it's interesting if we want to get into that too, because I'm turning more into interdisciplinary stuff. But just to give you an example of something that happened recently about, well, hold on this. Let me tell you the thing I do in this class to then tell you something interesting, if that's okay. So I'm teaching this class on, it's supposed to be an introduction to philosophy, but Elon, we don't have introduction to philosophy. We have How Should We Live? And so rather than reading a normal introductory class where we read Plato, Descartes, and Nietzsche, or whatever, I just don't care. So we're reading, I have it right here. We're reading The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James, which is about the Haitian Revolution. We're reading Du Bois's John Brown and Huey P. Newton's autobiography. Like that's introduction to philosophy. And so we're reading this. And what their assignment is, they do these ruminations, very Nietzschean kind of thing, where I say, as you read,
what is the word?
Ruminations.
Okay.
Like I said, I did this dramatic thing. I say, how many stomachs does a cow have? I'm like 4. How does a cow chew? They eat and they go in their stomach and they vomit back up and go in the other stomach. And I say, this is how you should write. So what they do is they read it. As they read, they write and they mark up passages and things that strike them. Interesting, angry, whatever. I don't care. Whatever hits you. And then once you finish the reading for that day, go back and find the one that you want to sit with. And then ruminate, swallow, vomit, swallow, vomit, blah, blah, blah. Do that for 419 words. And at the end of that, there's a certain philosophical question that's going to emerge out of that particular site in the book and write that. And so when they come to class, they go into these small groups and they pull out the book and someone says, here's my rumination. It started on page 139. It's near the top, here it is. We read it together, in the group we read together. They then talk through rumination. They don't read it, share their question, and then that begins the conversation. And so you have a group of 3 to 6 people, and you have 3 to 6 different sites in the book. So it's grounded in the book. The book is open. They're reading the book, and they're erupting out of what struck them, and then building a conversation out of that. Right. So I do this a lot, and then we go from the small group to large group. But on Friday, we're having class outside, of course, and there's COVID's going around, so not everyone. It's not a big day this time. It's like there's like 11 students in the class, which is a nice size. And I'm sitting with the one group, and I hear the other group getting wild, like they're starting to be loud and they're laughing and that. Like I can hear the words they're saying, so I know it's about the book and it's about the concept of the class. But I'm like, I'll let them go with it. And then later, I go up over there and say, what's going on? And they're like, oh man, we're having this conversation. I said, okay, what's up? And they're like, we're trying to distinguish between privilege and power, and different kinds of privileges and different kinds of power. And sometimes we think they're the same. So I'm like, okay, great. So going on, and we're talking. And I said, oh, it sounds like you need a whiteboard, but we're outside, we don't have a whiteboard. So I go inside and grab those big white sheets of paper that have the sticky edge, and I just stick it to the column. There's these columns we're sitting there, and I just stick them around there, and so I give them markers. Say, all right, go to town. So I start drawing in and making charts and making connections and scratching things out, and they're standing and doing this, and the other group is starting to look like, what's going on over there? And I go over there and say, oh, guys, do you want to see? Well, come on. So yeah, so they come over, and then they're starting to talking, and then they're into it, and there's still like 40 minutes left of the class, and we stood, like we were so energized, and the conversation was so alive that we didn't want to sit. So like that's the kind of excitement and transformation. But what's really interesting here is that we were talking about these different kinds of privileges, and they're going earned and unearned. And they said, like, well, what are the kinds of unearned? And I said, like, well, race is unearned. And they're like, yeah, that might be the only one. And I thought, so you might want to think about that one. And maybe when you think about that one, can you look around you and see who's all standing here? They're like, I don't know. I said, yeah, they're all dudes, right? See all the women right there? Do you think they might have a say about what's an unearned privilege? And they're like, oh yeah. And then so the women were like, what the fuck, guys? So they were angry, and they were saying these things, and it wasn't like real fire, but it was just attention. And so by the end of the class, as it ended, these women came up to me and said, "Can we start our own group? We start a group, women in philosophy." And I thought, yes, absolutely. What do you want to do? And said, well, we want to start with next group. We want to have a group only of women because we have some things we need to talk about, and we don't want these men in the space right then. And I thought, sounds great. That sounds awesome. So I think just like an example of structuring dialogical spaces and exercises. And when I say dialogical spaces and exercises and structure, I don't actually just mean like rules of conversation. I do mean that too, but I mean your body. Like I had this stupid phrase that came up yesterday, which was something like, I forget it. It's like my body as baton, like a conductor, right? I can actually control. I really think about what bodies are in classrooms. Often really forget, right? And how I can control a class, a conversation, simply by where I put my body, right? I can start a conversation by sitting down. I can end a conversation by standing. I can provoke someone to speaking by going near that. Like, so I can control a conversation or guide a conversation simply by just moving my body around, let alone what I'm saying. And in this case, I was doing that, right? I was letting the energy go, and then I moved around and sat with it. So these are the kinds of improvisational and dialogical practices that I have come to really value.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So like creating spaces where things can emerge that weren't, you didn't plan for them to merge, and it's kind of like there's a freedom and a creativity and a spontaneity that's allowed by the orientation of the practice itself, where it really invites that kind of spontaneous type of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. All right, so let's talk about some of the things that you're working on specifically, because I feel like we can talk about this all day long.
Sure.
The other approaches and stuff that we're talking about. I think that's fascinating. So in terms of the work that you've been doing, I know that you have a couple of books that have come out recently. One on, so there's three American Hegels. There's one with Deleuze and Stoicism, one Deleuze and Lucretius, and then there's one that's being worked on now, which is the Phenomenology of Black Spirit.
That's right.
Yeah. So tell me about the work that you're doing. Like where are those things? Why those ideas? Why those ideas? Very narrow question.
Yeah. So then I can turn to the place I stopped earlier about when I came.
Yeah.
That actually might be the perfect way to begin to run up into that. And so when I came to Elon and I started, tell me if I'm mixing up what we've talked about already, but when I came to Elon, when I started encountering the South through immigrant eyes and recalling George Yancey's conversations and reading and Malcolm X's stuff in class, I saw the urgency of race as being the dominant philosophical question, and philosophy just being, if it's not about this, then what is it about? So as an American white dude, and so this is where the Hegel stuff will come in. And so one thing that we started to do as a department, which is we've only had white people as long-term or permanent philosophers. We've never hired a person of color as a permanent member of the department. And we thought maybe we should change that. But to do that, there's like the whole problem in the integration, right? Integrating a person of color into a white space when it's only been a white space is just going to replicate the problems that have always been the problems in integration. We need to change the space in order to actually be open to, more, I think, justifiably, ethically, and truly bring people of color into the department, as we want to do. So we said, well, maybe we just should start reading Black history. So we started reading. We read the Fred Douglass's narrative of Life of a Slave, the first one, the first narrative, the first biography. We read Booker T. Washington a bit up from slavery. We read I.W. Wells, some of her Red Record, and then a bit of Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, and then the semester ended. But as we were reading this, I started to realize that this is really eerily similar to the movement in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, in particular, chapter 4, which is like in one translation, in the Miller translation, like almost 40 pages. So it's not that long.
Self-consciousness.
That's right. So master slave up to the end of self-consciousness and up for a reason. So just self-conscious, not consciousness and not reason. And I was thinking, that's interesting. Like, what does that mean, right? And I thought, that could be a good book. But that I've not been doing this long, right? And it'd be a certain kind of thing for a white dude to do this. So I thought, I'll just hold on to the idea, whatever, and if an opportunity comes up that I can write with someone whose lived experience is Black, then maybe it'll be a more justifiable thing to do. So then I was at this conference and I saw this guy who was presenting. He's an African-American man. His name is Biko Mandela Gray. And he was presenting, if I remember correctly, on Levinas and Toni Morrison and the voyeurism of the white gaze of Black suffering. And I remember physically sitting at a table and looking at him do this and thinking like, man, I want to think with you. Like, I just want to think with you. And so later that evening, we're at the bar, so we're late into the night, and I said to him, I said, all right, so I love the way you think. Don't say anything yes, don't say yes now, but I want you to write a book with me. And he's like, I just met you like a few hours ago. And I said, don't worry, I have this idea. And I sketched it a bit. And then weeks later, I called him and gave him the idea. And he said, like, he was cautious, understandably, but he said yes. And so we started to sketch the idea. So there's 6 basic moments in this chapter. And I had 3 corresponding to Black thinkers. And so we wanted to know if it would go for the rest of them. And I said, I have this weird idea too, which is, how about I make the writing of this book into the teaching of the class? So in the class, it was a senior seminar, I divided into 6 parts. And for a day or two, we read Hegel, and for a day or two, we read the Black thinker. And as the students wrote their chapters, I wrote the chapters in our book. Now, I didn't just write it. We were in constant conversation, and he actually came to campus twice to give 2 talks. And when he was here, we would spend days just reading line by line Hegel and talking about it. So we're constantly sketching it together, even though I'm doing the majority of the initial writing. But by the end of the class, the students had written their 6-part seminar papers, and I had written 90,000 words in a book. And there's this whole thing about vulnerability and teaching, because I actually shared my writing on a Google Doc with the students so they could see me write, to see all the ugly process of going from madness to finished product, which became this whole pedagogical exercise or practice I called teaching, learning, apprenticeships, which I can talk more about. But so we then had these 6 parts, these 6 chapters, and by the time though, they were all dudes. So like, oh, we can't, this is not good. We're missing a bunch of people here. So then we said we have to include more. We have to include non-men. So then we did. and we set up this this book, and it will be, I will say it, but don't worry about if it's these words are not familiar, just to see where it moves. So the Hegel's master slave corresponds to Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs. The next moment is Stoicism, which corresponds to Booker T. Washington and Ida B. Wells. Next moment is Skepticism, which is W. Du Bois and Anna Julia Cooper. And then there's 3 moments in Unhappy Consciousness, beginning with Devotion, is Marcus Garvey and Zora Neale Hurston. Sacramento Work and Desire is Martin Luther King Jr. And Ella Baker. And the last moment is Mortification, and it's Malcolm X and Angela Davis. So we wrote this up, and then I gave it to him, and he started to write. And then over that period, next few years, we would have relationship. We developed a friendship. We became friends through the writing of this thing, to get back to the other, right? Philosophy as practice, as community, as real relations. And that we were realized was that there's the philosophical content, like the terms and stuff, but the actual content of the book is, what does it mean for a white philosopher and a black philosopher to write a book of philosophy together in a single voice? And we think this will be the first book ever written by a white and black philosopher in a single voice. So that became the actual content, the ground of the book, and everything else is rooted there. So over the years, we kept having long conversations through the pandemic, and up until now. And we're going to have a conversation. He's coming to actually Elon in about a month to have our book launch. There's going to be 2 book launches, one here and one in December in Toronto. And so our friendship comes out of that, and it's the book that I'm proudest of, I think, right? So that's the one book, and then there's another book coming up, but I'll stop there because.
Well, I just have a question. I mean, in the introduction, the one thing I just jotted down, it says that Biko had read enough about Hegel to recognize the anti-blackness at the heart of his thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And Ryan had read so much at Hegel that he recognized the disturbance at the heart of Hegel's phenomenology, blackness. Mm-hmm. So in there is the concept of anti-blackness and blackness. Mm-hmm. And then also, I guess, related to that is, let's say, whiteness as well. Sure. So for people that don't understand what that means, mm-hmm. and I guess, and how is it located in Hegel? And I have so many other questions about how, like, because there's so much of the I guess the critical theory that I'm encountering through different people, or at least the way that it's explained, is it's located mainly as kind of an outgrowth of Hegel. Mm-hmm. Of Marx. Mm-hmm. And then obviously Marx was a reader of Hegel. Sure. So is that kind of the following of that trajectory? Is that a fair characterization? And where, there's a lot of questions, so I'll just stop there and see what emerges.
Yeah, so one thing that Biko means, or what we meant there, was that Biko sensed the anti-blackness at the heart of Hegel. There's 2 main things I think we can mean there. One is that modernity itself, the project of modernity, beginning out of the Renaissance into the scientific age and Descartes in the 16th, 17th century, occurred as Europeans were going to other places and enslaving people, and starting to really construct the Europe as the most advanced project in humanity, as the Europeans defined it, but in the process of enslaving others. So in the process of proclaiming themselves human, the highest humans, closest to God, they are in the process of dehumanizing others. And so the self-articulation in modernity came after right? The negative relation, the dehumanization of others. So others are non-Europeans are not human. And secondarily, human, we Europeans are. And this is this constant thing because economically, politically, geographically, technologically, every way, Europe is formulated through this process, through the exploitation of non-Europeans, as it became, then the articulation of race. So there's this thinking that I find very compelling in Black studies, which is the modernity is really anti-Blackness. that's what this is. Everything is on that, and so whiteness is secondarily, right, comes second. So there's first anti-Blackness, and then there's whiteness. So in Hegel, as in a way, the most expansive thinker of European identity, sets this in a historical, developmental, some people say theological, history that leads up to that. And so the Africans and indigenous peoples not from Europe are now like lucky to be part of this process, because otherwise they are just more like animals, and they're not sophisticated, they're not advanced, they are ahistorical, they don't think, right? They have no thinking. And so Hegel's saying all this shit, right, and thinking all this stuff. And so that anti-Blackness, which is at the heart of modernity, then becomes really articulated in Hegel's own construction of that.
So I just want to stop you because I want to make sure that I'm clear. So are you saying that Hegel actually said those things?
Yes.
I know enough about Hegel to not know anything, right? So
yeah.
I've read very select things. So you're saying that part of his project is actually this conversation about certain people have a certain privileged relation to knowledge, let's say, because their capacity for thinking gives them that kind of advantage, if you will.
Yep. And others lack it. And he actually says like that slavery is the process by which Black people, or the African, he talks about, come to learn to think. It's an education. So it's good for them, right? There's horrendous things. Yeah, he says these things very clearly in the book on the philosophy of history. So
so the work that he did, kind of where he goes back and he looks at the history of philosophy and he goes through the different thinkers.
No, not there, although it's there too. But it's in the philosophy of history, not the history of philosophy. So there's two, yes, philosophy or history is the object, but then he has lectures on the history of philosophy, where he moves through those lectures. And it's primarily in the philosophy of history, although it is also in the other bit.
Okay. And I have another question that may not be related to this, and I don't want to go too far afield because I feel like this is important. But so what is the relationship between, because Nietzsche also has a conversation about the master-slave morality, right? And then Hegel, and as far as I know, they're not reading each other, right?
Well, I mean, Nietzsche read Hegel.
Okay.
Right. So, Hegel dies in 1831, and Nietzsche's born in 20 years later, or 10 years later. So it'd be, after that, right? Hegel's dead before Nietzsche is alive. So, and Nietzsche's writing about master slave much later. So 1870s, 1880s, to a degree. So Nietzsche knows Hegel because Hegel's all around. Now, at that time in Germany, Hegel has diminished popularity. So after Hegel dies in 1831, he's huge. He's like an intellectual celebrity. And these two factions, loosely speaking, break out: a more conservative and a more radical, more left-leaning, maybe version. Marx is in the left-leaning version of that. The kind of statist and more religious and Christian as the other version. So they carry that for a while, but I would say within 15, 20 years, it's kind of out of date. Right? People moved on from Hegel. And so when Nietzsche is doing his thing, Hegel's not as big, but he's still around. He's still present. So, and Nietzsche's a very voracious, wide reader. So he is definitely. I can't imagine. I don't know. I don't know any specific places to point, but I can't imagine there's any way he could not have known about the master-slave dialectic. So he knew about it, but they're doing very different things, for sure. Now, Hegel. I actually wrote this piece for this French journal on Nietzsche and James Baldwin, in which I show how Baldwin corrects Nietzsche's thinking about masterliness and slavishness. He's got them backwards. So you actually read Nietzsche against himself to show how that the figure of the emergence of the slave is actually more empowering, more active and independent than the master. So, anyways, stop there.
Okay, and in terms of relating that to, let's say, Marxist theory and then critical theory and then the American experience at the moment, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested in what I know that people can probably write a lot on this, and probably a long conversation, but the delineation between let's say the through line there to what's happening now, and how the work that you're doing, and let's say work like that, is designed to what? Explain or kind of deal with that, and then propose another way forward, or how do you see the intention of your work playing out? Like, what's possible? Is that clear question?
Yeah. I can answer that in terms of the trajectory of the two books I wrote and the one book I'm beginning writing now. So one, as we said at the beginning, one of the things about philosophy is this relentless and ruthlessly honest practice of examining oneself, right? And in writing these books, I'm doing that, especially writing with Biko, where he was learning about Hegel, but I was also learning about Black studies. And then so I was encountering my whiteness and learning about the Black experience and Black history and Black thinking and all those different things. So I'm learning about this. And so it's this process of, for me, book writing isn't simply a job, right? It actually is therapeutic. I learn about myself through it. I find myself in it. I find myself articulated in it. I was amazed in that one moment in Frederick Douglass's narrative where he talks about learning to read and learning to write, and how he began to locate time, temporality, and look at himself. Like once he's able to see himself on the page and capture his thoughts on a page, it has this external substance, right? And so now he started to be able to think about himself, hold himself as an object through that process of writing that, and then sculpt himself. And I think that's what I'm doing, right? So, and doing the Phenomenology of Black Spirit book, I'm doing that. I'm also doing something which is putting together Hegel with Black thinkers, where they often don't go together, right? Because Biko talked about the inherent and Black to Blackness. So a lot of Black studies people are like, why the hell do we want to read this totally racist guy? And a lot of Hegel people are like, well, they're not doing philosophy, right? So they're not talking to each other. But what we want to do is no, they're doing really interesting things. And the thing about Hegel that I think is most interesting is, and the reason why he's so useful for critical philosophy, particularly decolonial Black thinkers, people of color, women, different than almost every other philosopher, is his attention to negativity, his attention to the excluded, those who are othered, and how Hegel doesn't just think of them as peripheral, marginal. He thinks of them as actually what it's all about, right? So in the master-slave dialectic, who wins is the slave. The slave moves on, right? The master just stays kind of there in a way, right? Static. And so if you put all the energy and all the determination in the excluded figure, then when you are an excluded figure, you're a Black woman, you're like, oh, Hegel's got this right? So there's this kind of power there. So my thought are then, we can now insert these Black thinkers into the canon in order to change the canon. So the part of the process of writing these is to push philosophy as a discipline in books, in classroom, whatever, to start treating people like Du Bois and Frederick Douglass and whoever as philosophers, because they are. And in doing this work, I'm making them, I'm bridging it. So, hey, you can, it's happening. Like, so I'm not the only one doing this, but it's just, obviously, that's one of the goals. The other book is Three American Hegels. And it's about these three American guys, ranging from like 1825 until the last guy dies in 1980 or 1978. So kind of chronological. And they're all thinkers of Hegel as practice, as lived, as concrete. So not the kind of very esoteric, very abstract, very academic Hegel, but the Hegel as the first figure in this book. His name is Henry Brockmeyer, as he says, the place to learn the dialectic, Hegel's figure of thinking, is hunting squirrel. So like, oh man, that is a very interesting way to think about Hegel, and the way I was taught at Duquesne, or at least the thing I learned at Duquesne. I don't know if I was taught that, but and so as I began thinking about how discipline can be different and learning about my own whiteness and all that in that book, this book was, well, what does it mean to be a white American Hegelian? And to do that, this is the Hegelian move, you tell the genealogy up to you. So then I did what I saw the genealogy of a practice-oriented Hegel, from Henry Brockmeyer to Horace Williams, the second Hegel, to John William Miller, the third Hegel. So this is me doing this process of working it out. There's a German word, which I learned from a philosopher named Susan Niemann. And the German word is a long word, but it's you can break it down. It's Vergangenheit aufarbeitung. And Vergangenheit is past or history, right? Auf means out of, or can mean that. And Arbeitung, Arbeiten is labor, right? So it means doing the hard process of laboring, of working out the past by working out of the past by working the past out, that kind of thing. And that's what I see this book doing, right? I'm telling this genealogy and trying to articulate myself in this history. And then the book I'm now writing, which is about John Brown, the radical abolitionist, John Brown. It's a kind of the inversion of that Phenomenology of Spirit, because the Phenomenology of Spirit was like pretty much one white thinker, and then 12 Black lives. This is one white figure and a bunch of Black thinkers through whom I'm reading and learning from about John Brown. So, and this I think is going to have a more broadly appeal. This is finally to answer your question: what is it trying to do? What is it for? And I think one thing more broadly conceived is, what does it mean to be a white person involved in racial justice work and anti-racism and stuff like that? And the main distinction I'm drawing here is something between being an ally and being an accomplice. And I think that we can learn from John Brown how to be an accomplice and not just an ally.
Go.
So the John Brown book is in the initial stages, so just getting started. And this actually connects to my teaching, because I teach books that you're going to be part of my writing. So this is, again, part of my practice. And I often teach books that I have not read. I've read around, or I know what they're doing, but there's a kind of newness to them. And I'm teaching John Brown right now. And one of the things that I see in John Brown, what it could be for, or its purpose, and thinking about the distinction between ally and accomplice. And there are these lessons that I'm drawing as I'm beginning to write about this. I was at a conference a few weeks ago in Charleston where I first presented these ideas. And these lessons of John Brown are trying to figure out what an accomplice is. And one way to think about that is, there's a problem with this phrasing, but I haven't found the better phrasing yet, is like, what price are you willing to pay? Or how much is at stake? As an ally, this is phrasing that comes from James Baldwin, but as an ally, you can like put up the Black Lives Matter sign and go to the protest, and then you can get in your Volvo and go back to your white suburb and send your kids to private school. Right? But as an accomplice, you pay the price, right? And John Brown paid the full price. So Frederick Douglass said of John Brown, I fought for the slave. John Brown died for the slave. So I'm not saying you need to, die or pay the highest price, but I'm saying here's someone who did, and what can we learn from him about how to fight injustice, racial injustice, and create a better society, a better future. And I think John Brown has a lot to teach us. One of the things that I'm most excited about this book is that I like taking different weird angles into books. So, for example, my Deleuze and Stoicism book is all structured like an egg. Right? It's
an egg. Is that what you said?
An egg. Yeah.
Okay.
Physics is the shell, and the albumin of the egg is logic, and the yolk, the yellow, is ethics. And so this is how they structured, and I structured my book this way. They're kind of like engaging metaphorics. Although I always think that metaphors are actually doing thinking. They're not external to thinking, they are thinking. So for this book on John Brown, I'm structuring it like a suite, like a musical suite, S-U-I-T-E. But not just any musical suite. It's a jazz suite, and in particular, John Coltrane's A Love Supreme. And there's many reasons why I want to do that, but the basic idea is that the four parts of Coltrane's jazz suite correspond very well to the four parts, the four themes in the book that I want to write on John Brown, with the exception of the last one. For Coltrane, it's psalm, because there's a religiosity to it. And for me, it's more about philosophy, so it's not psalm, it's apology, as in the tradition of like a Socratic apology, King's letter from Birmingham jail, that kind of stuff. So a defense. But that's what's happening, and there's reasons why that. But one thing that's really fun about it is that I'm trying to find collaborators. As maybe it's beginning to become clear, I love collaborating with people. I find that it's far more energetic and it just does much better work. Right? Creates much better work. I'm looking to just find some composers and musicians to actually write the music to the John Brown suite. So I'm going to write the book, and then I want to also have the music to go with it. And just before we started talking, I met someone at this conference where I presented the lessons of John Brown, and they did this really interesting thing about the Stonewall Rebellion, which happened in Charleston in 1731 or something like that. And they seem interested in composing a part of the John Brown suite. And there's this interdisciplinarity. So thinking about philosophy, not just for philosophers, but for more broadly, right? Like that, translating the philosophy into music. And like I had done with one of my colleagues at Elon, to dance. So another key part of my philosophical practice is collaboration across disciplines, and maybe in some way always trying to be the artist that I'm failing to be.
Oh, I love that. I mean, I think the idea of interdisciplinary work and, trying to bridge that, as many of those things as possible is fantastic. I mean, I think in a lot of ways it brings it to life. It creates something different. So that's very interesting. So you're talking about like writing a book and then having like a musical piece that goes along with it and is correlated to the different movements in the piece, if you will.
Yeah, and I was trying to correspond them to different songs. So he has a favorite song, and then he had a couple other his favorite songs. And out at this conference, this beautiful woman, this 82-year-old African American woman, who came up to me and just like called me out in this beautiful way, and tell me stories about going to school with John Lewis and having lunch with Langston Hughes and all this amazing stuff, right? Like she said you should think about using spirituals and slave songs and use that as a basis. So I want to have all Black or people of color composers to write these things, and so each chapter will then have a kind of main song behind them, and then there will actually be music based on them.
Okay, so I have a question about, because this is something I encounter quite a bit when it comes to, Heidegger is one of my main philosophical heroes, like the phenomenology that he does, the ontology, and a lot of the later work on, developing a phenomenology of listening, and one that's very attuned to hearing and taking our, let's say, receptive capacities and Stimmung and these different things very seriously. And he was a Nazi, right? So there's an element there of, obviously that's not good, right? So, the fact that, like, what I heard you saying when you're dealing with Hegel, it's not, let's say, demonizing Hegel, but understanding that there is that element in there, and then understanding the movement of the thought and how to bring it into engagement with, Black thinkers in a way where there's some sort of mutually enriching something, learning, let's say, a dialectical process of learning, I guess, that comes out of that. And I just think that that's very interesting that you're able to go back with another, with a Black thinker, enter into, Hegel's thinking,
Right.
and reckon with that in a way, that something comes out of it really positive, and use it as a teaching, as a heuristic device, in a way that can be really helpful. And I really appreciate that. I think part of the reason why there was some trepidation earlier when I was talking about critical, the critical race theory or whatever, is that it has occurred to me that a lot of it, at least that what you see in the mainstream, becomes anti-something. And it can be, it's like, okay, that's bad, so demonize that in some way, and it becomes, it seems to me it could be more productive than that, I guess, in some sense. Like, how do we learn from the past and the history in a way that informs, the future, and creates a different world, and doesn't reciprocate something where it causes more division? That's been my concern. And I think when I was reading the introduction, and I see anti-Blackness and the Blackness and all that stuff, and that's why I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting. And then to hear what you actually did performatively is really fantastic. I mean, I really acknowledge that move that you made, and the commitment to rigorous authenticity, and really reckoning with something in a way where what emerges is a new possibility, and not something else. So how do you see that? I mean, so many of the people that I read, let's say, for example, they're very, it's like demonizing of, let's say, Heidegger, right? And on one sense, I understand that, right? No, I don't want to be complicit in any kind of anti-Semitic thing either, as well, but I don't there is a part of me that doesn't really pay attention to a lot of that, because I focus on the phenomenology and I focus on the ontology and I focus on the work and I focus on the Mitsein and and then what I feel is an incredibly powerful idea about our relationship to death and finitude and what's there, let's say, in relationship to the Stoics and how important that is into the way that we live life. And there's this inescapable reality that he was a Nazi and not just, someone who in some way was involved as a rectorate and said, not nice things about Husserl's teacher and things like that. So how do you think through thinkers that way?
Yeah, and there's so much in that, and I have. Yeah, I'm trying to think what's the best place. The lesson of John Brown is to listen to learn from Black thought. Like when Martin Luther King, when he was in school, he encountered Hegel, and he didn't think this is terrible. He thought this is fascinating, right? And Malcolm X too. Right? He read Hegel, and there's somebody once said like he was kind of embarrassed by it, but he actually loved Hegel. Hegel actually was his favorite thinker. And so like just like look at like who's reading Hegel, just for example, for that, right? And if they're getting something from it, then follow their lead, right? Doesn't mean mirror them, but just take a note from them, begin there. So that's the first thing. The who's valuing, who's reading whom, right? There's a reason why Du Bois read so much Plato. Not because Plato, as people say, is a proto-fascist, because there's something really important there, right? So start with that. Second thing is that if you are not able to both to read a person and value what is valuable and call out what needs to be called out in the same breath at the same time, then you are a bad thinker. I like that. And I don't mean like you're bad, you can't be better. I mean, you're bad and there's a block because there's something that you need to work on yourself
that you're not dealing with. Yeah.
Right. And that's fine. Just start with that, right? So it doesn't mean you can just like put out two categories and say here's the bad stuff and here's the good stuff. No, not at all. It's all intertwined, right? Like Heidegger's Nazism can show up in his ontology, right? And it could not, right? So it means trying to being sophisticated and good enough to be able to understand that, because there's nothing that will replicate the past than an outright rejection, an abstract generalized rejection. That's just guaranteeing you're going to keep doing the same shit. So there's that, right? That's the first. That's I guess like the second and third thing. Who knows what number we're on now? If you want to move beyond it, you need to do the work, right? The boring ass work of working it out, right? How do you work out of it? By working it out. Those minor steps that take years, that don't get recognition, that blah, 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 right? You have to do the work in order to work it out and work out of it. And in fact, so let's call it our 4. How number 5? Number 5 is if you are not doing that, then you are disrespecting Hegel or Heidegger. Like you shouldn't be trying to be their apologists, like you're you're some flatterer in a court, right? They're looking at King Louis and just saying all these nice things. That's bullshit, right? Like if you actually respect these people and value them, then you need to call them out. You have to do that, and on their terms. This is what one thing that Hegel says, like this, the most boring thing a philosopher can do is poke holes in the edges of something and say, oh, I got you here. Oh, you didn't carry the one here, right? He says, go to the heart of it.
Yeah. What
does everything lie on? And go and start there and lay in there. So like there's that kind of thing. Well, I guess I'll stop there for a second because that's a lot.
Yeah, no, I think that's so important what you just said, because that it really is thinking, right? And that is something that is critical for people that even in your own life, let's take out specific thinkers that thought specific things about specific ideas, but as a human being, to be so for something that you're blind to the potential. John Vervaeke talks about this all the time, actually, in relationship to Plato, that there's a difference between bullshit and self-deception. And one is, the idea of self-deception is you can be so aligned with an idea that you can't see the potential dangers in there. And that's where you have to go to work, is to make sure that you're not apologizing or defending something, and also not completely just rejecting something because as a reaction, but really actually critically engaging with something and looking at it from all the different angles, and looking at, if you do have a reaction, what is it over here in your thinking that is causing that, and using it as an edification, as a detoxifying element in your own life and your own thinking. So that's what I really appreciate about what you were saying, is that, like, you're engaging in all of these things, not just because you find them interesting and fascinating, which you do, but also because it's a pedagogical exercise in your own self-awareness, and actually doing it to become a better human being.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, absolutely. And so that was one other thing I was going to bring up go back to the number one, which is the learn from Black thinkers, which is whether or not one wants to cancel Hegel or Heidegger, right? We are Hegelian and Heideggerian.
Right.
But like this is what we are. So it's just like, what flight from yourself could there be besides just, oh, we're not that, right? Like that's just so. If you want to work it out, you start with what we are and what we have. And this is Audre Lorde's line. One of my favorite, I think it's Audre Lorde. I think she said this. They're talking about how, like being a Black person in America, or being in colonized, like being an Indian person in India, but speaking English. And so, like, I guess it works more with Audre Lorde and being African-American, which is, their language were erased, so they don't know that anymore. So they have to speak the colonizer's language, or speak the enslaver's language. And if you want to just cancel, all right, then you're only have that language. So you're just silencing yourself, right? So she says, I don't want to speak the colonizer's language, but I need it to talk to you. That is, in order to create revolution and to change things, I have to do it. This is what we have. Otherwise, I can't speak to you, and I can't hear you, and I can't communicate with you. So start with what we are, what we have. We are Hegelian. We are a white society. We are a male-dominated society. We are all these different things, right? So to work that out, we can't just cancel it out. We have to use it. And using it means doing the uncomfortable and boring labor.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that, man. So much of the work that I've engaged in over the last 10 years in coaching and leadership is really about the transformative power of really getting clear about where your thinking comes from, and being able to be really honest about that. Like even the things that are, especially the things that are uncomfortable. And I also know in a lot of ways, like I'm someone that's in long-term recovery from addiction, that is a part of my life that was very real. And there were obviously some things that were unresolved at that time, and whatever led to it is whatever led to it. And it's a huge part of who I am now, because it was something that was authentically dealt with. So I don't, it's not part of I don't identify with that anymore. And I don't think about, who I am as a person that's defined by that. And at the same time, it informs a big part of my understanding of life and suffering and pain and the reality of that and all of that, you know? So I think so much of really reckoning with our history is absolutely critical. And I guess what I'm saying is I've seen it done well, and I've seen it done not so well. And I got really present in this conversation to a way to do it really well. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. Yeah, reckoning is tough and unfinishable, but it's I think philosophy, if not necessary, is very important to an authentic reckoning.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess that's a good place to end, in the sense that, like, again, from the very beginning, Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living, right? And this enterprise that I'm engaged in, whatever it's called, is the examined life. So what does the examined life mean to Ryan Johnson? I mean, I feel like we just had a long conversation about it, but that's how I end each one of these conversations. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think I would just change the language from examine to the word you just said, which is reckoning. So the examined life is one that is that undergoes a ruthlessly honest reckoning. And like I remember this this tiny little story. Whenever my wife got her green card for the US, and she's living in the South, and she's like, well, now I'm part of it, and we better reckon with it. So we went on one summer, maybe the summer before COVID, I think it was. We went on a Southern Reckoning tour, and we drove to the largest slave port in the US, which is New Orleans, and we stopped in the lynching memorial and all sorts of stuff. But one thing we did is we went to this one plantation outside of New Orleans called the Whitney Plantation. And although I've come to now call plantations forced labor camps, in the hopes of trying to get people to stop having weddings at forced labor camps. But I was there, and it's the only one of the time that told only of the enslaved experience. And it was reckoning to the nth degree. And I was so overwhelmed by it. I mean, I was like crying the whole time that I was on the back of the big house, right? The White House, the White People's House. And I just found this the other day. I blacked out and just hit the wall and almost fell down the stairs. So like, and then the tour had to end, and they called these EMS in, and I just found the EMS report, which said like lost consciousness on the back of the big house. Like these are actually the words. But yeah, it was this weird moment where the world, if you go like blacked out this way, you know, I wasn't drinking at all. It was just, you know, nothing. It was just a hot day, and the world just went like just crushed into me. And I woke up, and there's this Black woman tending me, saying, "Are you okay?" And it's the EMS woman, and like, I don't know what's going on. So I had the world, yeah, just everything was different after that moment. So not to like this moment is like, you know, I'm making a lot of this, but the unreckoned life is not worth living, something like that.
Yeah. We have to put that in the forward of one of your books or something, like blacked out on the back of the back porch of the big house.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, well, I feel like we could talk forever, and this has been really amazing, and I feel like we can probably and let's do it. Let's have multiple conversations in the future as well. But I think this has been a really productive and illuminating conversation for me. I think in a lot of ways, this talk has helped me understand more about the mission that I'm on at the moment, which is regardless of whether people become academic philosophers or not, life right now is so in need of people reckoning with what's actually happening, in their own life, in their own families, in their own, in their own communities, in the world as a whole. And I think, philosophy thought about in this way is something that has nothing to do with, the sitting in a classroom or even going back and, accustomizing yourself with the history of the thoughts, which is a very valuable pursuit in and of itself, but that people begin to take seriously, that living an examined life is really important. And the work that you're doing is really important, my friend. So thanks for coming and being a demonstration of that. And I guess we can end with where I'll leave links and stuff in the description of the podcast, but what are things that people can go and where can they find your work?
Yeah, so I have a book coming out, The Phenomenology of Black Spirit, with Biko Mandela Gray, that comes out in November with Edinburgh University Press. So I think you can just type in Phenomenology of Black Spirit and Google, and it's the first thing. We're going to have 2 book launches. So if anyone is around Central North Carolina on Thursday, October 27th, there's that, or in Toronto, Canada, on December 16th, I believe. There's going to be like a really awesome talk with some amazing thinkers there. Otherwise, I have some articles that would be essentially interesting to people. One on James Baldwin and Hegel on honesty. It's pretty fun. And yeah, I mean, I think most of my work comes published by Edinburgh University Press. So I have a page there.
Okay. And you have social media that you're active on, or can people find you on social media? Are you
not really. I should be. No, I'm not. I have a faculty webpage which has some links to things.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll get the links from you and we'll put it in the show notes and people can find you there. And yeah, man, I really, again, I appreciate your time. I appreciate the work that you're doing. You're making the world a better place. And I know that I've gotten a lot out of this conversation. So I love you, buddy. Thank you for your time and we'll do it again.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
All right. Bye.
Cheers.